Hi, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to revisit history, culture, and religion and go a little bit deeper into how they intersect with the phenomenon of domestic violence. You may recall one of our earlier lectures, we kind of touched on the role that history, culture, and religion play, and that was part one. This one's part two. We're going to go into it a little bit deeper, go a little bit further back in time. Obviously, with something about like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, we could teach an entire semester just looking at the history of the phenomenon, the various aspects that culture and religion play with it. For right now, we're going to go way back machine and sort of do a brief overview of the history and see how culture and religion tie into it. Then obviously in the weeks to come, each one of these aspects are going to be tied back in as we continue to investigate and examine domestic violence. After this particular lecture, we are going to turn the page in the next handful of lectures and start focusing on various theoretical connections between domestic violence and theoretical explanations for domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And even within those, you'll see history, culture, and religion sort of sprinkled in. So we'll start off this lecture looking at colonial times. So a lot of this focus is going to be focused on America, United States of America. And so that does not preclude us from, as we go forward, bringing in examples either for this class or for your own papers to think internationally. And I strongly encourage you to do that. But for the sake of time and brevity, we're going to focus a lot of this type of history stuff on what has happened in the U.S. So we'll start with colonial times before the official formation of the United States, then the early U.S. in the 1800s. We'll talk about some of the first efforts and recognition of domestic violence and in the rise of reform that took place in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Then we'll see what happened post-World War II. And then we've touched on the domestic violence revolution that began in the 1970s in the past, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we will finish off with sort of a few glimpses into what the current status, especially with how law enforcement respond to domestic violence, looks like in our country right now. Now, the readings that would correspond to this would be chapter 3 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. As we begin our journey into understanding the history of domestic violence, we need to sort of start with one of the baseline, and that is that domestic violence has been with us since the beginning of humankind. The term domestic violence, however, is relatively modern. It was a 20th century invention. And for most of history, most of human history, domestic violence as well as spousal rape were a part of everyday life. So why was this violence accepted? Well, because it was seen as the natural order of things. A man was supposed to display his authority over his family, and therefore it was legal for a husband to force himself on his wife, as well as to beat his wife and children. Now, as draconian as these hopefully look to you in our eyes here in 2020, they are the baseline that we had to start with when we look at human relations and human behavior. So the fact that domestic violence has been an integral part of sort of spousal relationships and partners and marriage for so many years, it's not surprising that we're still working to get past a lot of sort of what is left behind and a lot of the old ways of thinking that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's kind of what we're looking at. But we always have to understand that we started with an idea where it was completely accepted historically. In America, pre-colonial times, so prior to the American Revolution, we sort of take a glimpse. What was sort of the viewpoint of domestic violence, right? You have people who came to the shores of the colonies, either by choice or by force, to set up this new early country. But a lot of the traditions were still brought from old English common law. And so early settlers in America based their laws on these old English common laws. And a lot of those laws explicitly allowed or permitted wife beating. And the key thing was for correctional purposes. The man was seen as the leader of the house. In many ways, his wife, his children, as well as any other relatives that were living under his roof, the animals were all his property. And if you needed to, I use this word loosely, if you needed to appropriately train somebody or fix a problem, a correctional type thing, you were perfectly perfectly okay with the law to hit, scold, and things of that nature. And one of the things that the colonies thought that they were being progressive about was they tried to break away from that law of wife beating by saying that the husband was only allowed to whip his wife with a switch no bigger than his thumb. And so you can imagine, even though this sounds draconian to us, if you don't know what a switch is, imagine a stick or a branch from a tree, no bigger than his thumb to harm his wife. They, in their mind, still saw themselves as moving forward and being progressive. As our fledgling country became the official United States of America, we continue to see baby steps, and throughout this lecture, you're going to see little steps forward, oftentimes, unfortunately, followed by a step backwards, right? But the idea is to always try to be making these steps forward as far as our understanding, our handling of things regarding spousal abuse and domestic violence. So we look just at some, various instances and laws that popped up throughout our young country. And we see one, for example, in 1824, where Mississippi's Supreme Court ruled to allow a husband to administer moderate chastisement in case of emergencies. Okay, so already what are you starting to see? And this is one of the things as we try to think about how did people's mind think about progressive, taking these baby steps. Both this slide as well as the previous slide, things of, chastisement in case of emergencies, right? So there's always sort of that loophole. On the previous ones, for correctional purposes, a switch no bigger than the size of a thumb, right? So there's this sort of this message, this symbolic idea that we're moving forward, but there's pretty much always at this time a loophole where predominantly, in a male-female relationship, that the man has the authority to harm his wife and children if he thinks it's for the good of the overall family. And that's one of the things that we're still trying to get past. As we progress through the 1800s, we start to look at how was the country coming along, right? 1866, think back in your mind, we're just coming out of the Civil War era, and we're thinking there should be some sort of recognition of, of humankind, of, respect for beings across all genders, all races, all cultures, but things are slow to progress. For example, and I think this slide really illustrates something that sort of tells us about where our mindset was. So 1866, we're coming out of the Civil War, 13th Amendment attempts to end slavery. Things across the world across the United States are trying to move in a progressive fashion, and the respect for humankind is trying to emerge. But look at this. 1866, the American Society for the Prevention and Cruelty to Animals was founded. Great. We want to protect animals, right? We don't want to have slaughterhouses that are being overly cruel to the animals that we use for food. Dogs and cats on the streets. We don't necessarily need just to be torturing these poor things for no just reason. But think 1866. However, so by 1866, we're focusing on animals and why we need to protect them as sentient beings that need some sort of protection from humankind. However, you'll note that the SPCA predated both the prevention of cruelty to children as well as preventing any cruelty to women. And this is one of those blind spots that we see throughout various cultures, but especially here in America, when we think about laws and thinking in a progressive manner. There is a need and a push to protect animals, but yet the family environment was still sort of seen as being, that is not something that politically we can vote on. That is not something that our government should regulate. The family was still seen as sort of being its own autonomous structure where the man the male household head was seen as the authority figure, and he could make his own rules, his own sort of laws about how that family functioned, right? So we're sort of ignoring the need for, maybe we do need to make protection of children and women somewhat of a political and a social event. It should be something that the government should be able to have some level of regulation, but at this time period, it was still being overlooked. So when did we finally start to pay attention to women and children? 1874. So almost a decade after the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was formed, the SPCA obtained the protection of the state of Mary Ellen Wilson, a mistreated child. So what we see here is actually it was the Society for Protecting Animals actually took in under its care a mistreated child. And there's all of a sudden, it's like, oh my goodness, like this mind-blowing idea that like, oh wait, we forgot about, we were protecting the dogs and the cats and the cows and whatever else and the pigs, but we need to protect the kids too, because maybe not every household is running very well, and it shouldn't be seen as completely autonomous and up to itself. In April 1875, because of this particular case, the first child protective agency, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, was incorporated. And then following that, during the ensuing quarter century, more than 150 similar societies emerged. So we do see that it happened. It's just kind of an odd twist when we think about the fact that the society that was designed to protect animals actually had to be the people who really were the activists, who stepped up and said, you know what, no, children, and then later women, are also individuals that need to be protected. And so it's good that they finally made that movement, but it's a little slow that it took as long as it did. So also in the late 1800s, we see that there were some other sort of legal changes. Now, once again, keep in mind, one of the things I'm going to stress here is, are these legal changes sort of like blanket protection for women and children in these households? Or do you still see some of those loopholes, those ways for sort of the male authority figure to rationalize his mistreatment of his wife or his children? So keep that in mind as we look at some of these. 1871. Alabama becomes the first state to rescind the legal right of men to beat their wives. Great. 1882. Maryland became the first state to pass a law that made wife beating a crime, which was punishable by 40 lashes or a year in jail. But, and this is the key thing, in both of these, and these are only two examples, two early examples that originated in the South. But even with these, men were often excused on the grounds of quote unquote provocation and or the misdemeanors of their wives. So what do they mean by provocation and or misdemeanors? Well, if we look back through various court testimony or court transcripts, oftentimes what we see is it wasn't what we would call a very solid ground that these men argue for why they needed to harm their wives or harm their children. But it was often enough that they could sidestep these laws that were supposed to be in place to protect women and children, but maybe from a lot of outsiders' point of view, may have been merely symbolic, so that the legal system and politicians can say, look, we did the right thing, but yet were they actually effective in practice? And here's a quote from Thomas Kinnear, 1882. I did not live very happily with my wife. She obtained drink with the money I gave her for housekeeping. She neglected the children and used very coarse language. I have given her a push, but when the house was dirty, telling her to go away and clean it up, but never a push that could have hurt her. Right? These are the types of sort of justifications that men would say for why they had done certain negative things or harmful things to their wife and children. You know, saying, oh, she drank alcohol. Okay, but is that drinking alcohol, does that make you worthy of being beaten? No. Using coarse language, right? Neglecting children, okay, maybe somebody should step in if that is in fact true, but what was the level of neglect, right? This person, oh my goodness, the person wasn't doing enough housekeeping. Does that mean that person's worthy of being pushed or hit or slapped? No. And imagine most of us would look at it and say, of course it doesn't. But it gives you an idea that even when we have laws being passed, oftentimes many of them are just sort of very symbolic. 1886, similar idea that we'll see here. North Carolina courts declared that a criminal indictment cannot be brought against the husband unless the battery is so great as to result in permanent injury, endanger their life, or is malicious beyond all reasonable bounds. So here, not only do we still see sort of the loopholes for men to avoid the hammer of the law, so to speak, but we're also seeing sort of a step back from what we saw a decade earlier in Alabama with their examples, right? In North Carolina, they say like, no, we're not even going to bother going after the husband or the man unless there is permanent injury, right? So extreme forms of domestic violence. And as we've hinted at already this semester and are getting close to diving much deeper into, some of the most brutal and long-lasting domestic violence, sadly, is the stuff that doesn't leave a visible permanent injury, doesn't physically endanger their life, but has a toll on their psyche, their psychological aspect, their mental health, things of that nature. And let's compare what we were doing in the US around that same time, the late 1800s. So I had said earlier on this one that the US was, especially during colonial times, was trying to pride ourselves on being a little bit better, a little bit more forward thinking and progressive than stodgy old England. Well, let's look at what was going on in England in 1886. And this is one of the things, think about who was in charge as we had a queen, right? So we had a female head of the country. So with Queen Elizabeth's rise to the English throne, lawmakers began enacting reforms for women. So some of these examples were that wives could no longer be kept under lock and key. Life-threatening beatings were considered grounds for divorce, and wives and daughters could no longer be sold into prostitution, right? So these are things that were seen as very progressive, and with the help of a female head of state, were actually able to be brought into reality. So let's take a look as how U.S. continues to sort of progress in our thinking about domestic violence and our legal approaches to handle. So our first big attempt at reform in the United States was the 1890s. And so what you see here are some snapshots of cartoons, political cartoons, illustrations, and quotes that were taken from around the country to see how did we finally start to address this growing issue of domestic violence. And you'll see here I say it's the rise of reform, and then down at the bottom I say ... questionable reform, right? So one of the things that was interesting is we did start to see activists. Activists started coming out and sort of responding and say that domestic violence needs to stop. But it's interesting and a lot of parallels to other movements throughout the course of time. What's the better approach? Peaceful protesting, peaceful activism, or other forms? And this first sort of wave of reform, as you can see from some of these, was we started to see, I would say a positive thing is we started to see a female presence. Women started to speak out against these individuals who were, perpetrators of domestic violence. And we saw the strength in female form. But how were we trying to punish these offenders? A big push was sort of a throwback to old forms of punishment, very public forms of humiliation, embarrassment, and pain. Arguments for having people shackled to a post in the public and whipped. People being put in stocks in the towns, in the city center, so that people could, it's almost like having that scarlet letter put upon you. And so, although these were a reform and a progressive movement, you always have the question idea, does reacting to violence with more violent responses, is that always going to be our best way going forward for the long term? And as you'll see, this first wave of reform didn't last too long because there was eventually backlash to this form of activism. As we started to progress into the beginning of the 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century, not only did we have those public forums, those activist protests against domestic violence offenders, but also we started to see a little bit more of the true, sort of community level help being provided to victims of domestic violence, right? It was no longer just having some laws on the books that may or may not ever be enforced by the courts. It was no longer just sort of violent response to these offenders with whipping and throwing them in the stocks. Here is where we start to get away from our reliance on the courts and the cops. And I think that's another sort of theme that I'm going to, at least from my point of view, I would encourage you to think about as we go through this course is how can we respond to a situation or a phenomenon like domestic violence? And in order to benefit everyone, can we do it outside of sort of the legalistic areas of the cops and the courts? Can the community help? Can nonprofit organizations help? So 1899, we see the first juvenile court was created in Illinois. And most likely from either your corrections classes or other classes you've taken throughout your time here at Long Beach, one of the things that we realized around this time during 1899 was we were in sort of the rise of positivism and deterministic behavior was there, this progressive look at human behavior. And we saw sort of the realization that children are not just mini adults. They need to be treated differently than adults. So if an adult commits a certain crime, they should know better, and we can punish them accordingly. If a child does that, there's an idea that, well, that child may not even recognize the severity of this behavior that they're engaging in and the dangers of it. And that's what led to sort of the recognition of the juvenile court, that maybe it is the state, maybe it is the community that needs to look out for juveniles. And we saw this sort of approach to sort of not decriminalize, but take out sort of like the severity, the cops and courts type thing with the beginning of the juvenile court. About a decade later in New York, we see and this was only one of the first, this one in Buffalo, New York, but we started to see the popping up of what were known as family courts. And a quote related to this was, the concept was that it's better to solve family problems in a setting of discussion and reconciliation with social service intervention, right? That right there is huge. Starting to recognize that just by going into a home, what happens if all of a sudden the cops come in, take away the father, punish him, lock him up, put him in jail for a while? You've got potential fear within the eyes of the children or the wife. You're taking away what was often the sort of the breadwinner, the moneymaker for the family. And so even though you're removing the threat for a period of time, you may not necessarily be leaving that family in a better situation. And when the man is done with his punishment, whether it's jail time, whether it's being put in the stocks, whether it's receiving some lashings, do you think he's going to be reformed? Probably not. So this idea with right around 1910, the growth of these family courts, I think, is a pivotal time period in our understanding of domestic violence. Starting to see that let's bring people into so much more of a mediation and a discussion type of environment where we can have social services to help everyone involved get the help, get the treatment. When necessary, separate the children or the wife from the abusive spouse. And a lot of these courts went by, we would call them nowadays, we think of them as like family courts. But in early days, they were often referred to as domestic relations courts. So if you come across that terminology, that's where that comes from. And then in 1919, hopefully you are well aware of this, but if not, now's the time to know it. It wasn't until 1919 that women in this country finally gained the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So what we saw sort of, a lot of the people who led the sort of the suffrage movement that culminated in women's right to vote in 1919 were a lot of the same individuals who sort of laid the groundwork back in the 1870s and 1880s to start to try to call attention to what was going on behind closed doors in the family setting and saying, no, that should not be a private place where, the master of the house, the husband, has complete control. No. Society, politics, and the law should be able to step in when things get out of hand in order to better protect the victims. So as we move forward, post the 19th Amendment, you can imagine we have the Roaring 20s. So things are kind of crazy. We have Prohibition. We then drop into, starting in October of 1929, our country slips into the Great Depression, right? So focus is now less about social issues and more about how do we put any food on the table. Then we hit the early 1940s and we're involved in World War II. Coming out of World War II, we have this sort of leave it to Beaver, sort of idealistic view of the world, right? More women are going into the workforce thanks to World War II. We hope that they've earned the respect of their male counterparts, both in the household as well as out in society. And everything seems to be hunky-dory. However, that's not necessarily the case, right? A lot of things had just been swept under the rug for a couple decades and sort of ignored. And we see that when we sort of see some laws that sort of we see our ways to address domestic violence almost seem to be taking a little bit of a step backwards post-World War II. Example, 1962. The New York domestic violence cases were transferred from criminal court to civil court. So you may go, good. That's what Ryan was just talking about. We don't necessarily want the cops and courts thing, so maybe it's okay to move from the criminal court to another venue. However, look at the end of that sentence there. We're moved from criminal court to civil court where only civil procedures applied. So this is one of the takeaways. Anytime we change the law or change policies, some people may say we're doing it for the good, to make it more of a social service, civil discussion type thing. But can we still mete out those punishments when they are needed? And in this case, in New York, all of a sudden, the likelihood of a man receiving any sort of significant punishment was reduced during this time period. So to finish up with that statement, the husband would not face penalties as harsh as he would suffer if he was found guilty in criminal court for assaulting a stranger, right? So what I'm saying here is after this passage in 1962 in New York, all of a sudden, if a man assaulted a stranger, he would receive harsher penalties than if he assaulted his wife or his children in the same manner. So there is that sense of a step backwards. 1966, beating as cruel and inhumane treatment becomes grounds for divorce in New York. So that we're going, woohoo, we made a step forward. But once again, the plaintiff must establish that a sufficient number of beatings have taken place. All right, now think about this. And we're going to be watching some videos, and some of them are kind of tough to watch in the coming weeks, as well as reading about certain specific cases. And one of the tough things is if somebody's been unfortunately involved in a domestic violence situation for a long period of time, they may have quite a few beatings, but there may be no official record, right? It doesn't mean that they've gone to the emergency room where there's a note of their injuries and that those injuries are attributed to domestic violence. They may not call the cops to start making a record of this. And this is one of the things that we will see that grows out of this time period as a learning lesson, is the reminder that for social service agencies, as well as other volunteers that work with domestic violence victims, is that keeping track of events, because it is the totality of the circumstance. It's another phrase I've used earlier, right? Sometimes the sum of the damage and the pain is worse than any one particular incident or beating. And so even here in 1966, we see that it becomes grounds for divorce with if a victim is beaten by their spouse, but you put the burden of proof right back on the victim. And that will have plenty other ripple effects going forward. We'll talk about terms about, victim shaming becoming an issue that grows out of this. Just the fact that a lot of these victims may not have the resources to get help. especially if they're in a situation where they're typically the male spouse is controlling of who they communicate with, what kind of resources and media they're able to read, right? They may not even be aware of some of the things that are out there. So we're still working forward, but it's always step forward, step back, step forward, step back. So as we move into the sort of the civil rights era of the late 60s and early 70s, we start to see more steps forward. Good. And so this stop and start thing. 1967, the state of Maine opens what would become one of the first women's shelters in the United States, a place of refuge for these victims to get away from their abuser, and also potentially to get information from other people who can provide them with help, give them resources, right? Think about this wasn't a time period of the internet where you could sneak away and Google resources and help. This was a time when oftentimes your only form of education or reading was to go to the library or what you heard from your people at church or from your neighborhood. So the fact that these shelters started opening up was a big move in the right direction. And then also 1972, Minnesota follows with the launch of emergency housing for victims of domestic violence, both women and their children, and sort of the growth for this. And all throughout this time, as we've alluded to before, the 1970s was really sort of the hotbed of the growth of the domestic violence revolution. This is when the term domestic violence really starts to take a much stronger form in society, be recognized. And then one of the things that I've been sort of touched on earlier in this lecture is this final sentence. It claimed, the domestic violence revolution, it claimed that what goes on in the privacy of people's homes is deeply political. So some people may say, I don't really get what they mean by that. This is the point where we start to say no. What goes on behind closed doors is not something that it should be ignored by outsiders. It is not something that should be ignored by society or community members. It's not something that should be ignored by our elected officials or our law enforcement agencies. Rather, this is something that needs to be discussed and needs to be brought up into the public so that people can vote, people can learn, people can get an idea of what's out there for these individuals. So now that we've sort of come up to our current status, our current time, what are some of the takeaways from this lecture? The first is to think about the fact that domestic violence and spousal and partner abuse is nothing new. And I don't think that's all that surprising. It's been with us since the dawn of humankind. And the motivations and the reasons for why one partner chooses or thinks that they're forced in their minds to harm or hurt or abuse another partner. We'll talk about that. In our coming lectures, we're going to start diving into the theories that get into explaining sort of the dynamic between a victim and an abuser. But the reality is this is nothing new. It's been around with us for a long time. What we have seen that also I think I try to stress throughout this lecture is the idea that even when we've had progressive moves in this country, oftentimes those progressive moves sometimes may be a little bit, let's just say their aim may be a little bit off. So what sounds like a good move, whether it's the passage of a law or a certain types of punishment, maybe it's not exactly hitting the target because maybe there's loopholes. Maybe it opens up to other forms of criticism because of the type of punishment. And also there's often these step backs. And that's still what we see today when we look at sort of the status of domestic violence and how we respond to it in this country. Is sort of one step forward, a half step back, but always hoping that we're moving forward. Another thing that we have to think about here that was sort of illustrated were probably two really key periods. One was sort of our first effort at reform, which was the late 1800s into sort of the first decade or two of the 20th century, of the early 1900s, where we started to see groups coming together. We started seeing not just bringing this idea of domestic violence and harm within the household being brought out into the neighborhood and into the community, and sometimes literally out into the town square with the guy in Stockade out in the middle of the town center. But we also see the organization and motivation of groups. Many of these groups led by women. And we saw that the female voice really starting to take hold and bring this out into the daylight where the discussion needs to take place. The second major sort of revolution or progressive push began along and sort of coincided with the civil rights movement of the late 60s and into the early 1970s. And realized that there's an idea that we needed to further push our efforts to stem the growth of domestic violence. And as we saw from a previous slide, we actually have reduced by all measures. It appears that we are reducing the amount of domestic violence that occurs in the US, but it still is at numbers that are way too high. We need to work with that. Another common theme that hopefully you sort of saw with this was this idea of bringing the handling of domestic violence, sometimes have options that are not just cops and courts. Think about other ways where we have social service agencies, we have shelters, we have domestic violence volunteers, and agencies to work with individuals and have that. Because communication and information is one of the biggest things. You saw me mention on the previous slide when we saw the growth of some of these earliest women's shelters and emergency shelters for victims. One of the things was it was one of the only places that they could get information from other individuals. And sadly, I mentioned that back then we didn't have Google. Now we do have Google. We have the internet. So you would think that information is right there at the tip of your fingers when you start to type. But even in 2020, if you go to a lot of the various domestic violence websites or hotlines, one of the first things that they remind you is this: tell you that if you're calling, make sure that your abusive partner, husband, spouse, whoever it may be, doesn't have access to your computer or your phone. Because sadly, they'll check. Who have you been calling? What websites have you been visiting? So this idea of having perpetrators or abusers still try to hinder the opportunity for victims to communicate with others and get help is still with us today. So things are constantly sort of changing when we think about this phenomenon of domestic violence. And so on this last slide, I just want to show you, just remind you, there's quite a bit of variation in how we handle domestic violence, at least at the get-go, when we first get reports of it from state to state. So what I put up here was just a few examples of the arrest policies, right? Oftentimes, the first time that domestic violence really sort of becomes on the radar of the cops and courts, which is still one of our primary ways of addressing the issue, is when a 911 call is made or when someone reports something and the police are called out. So as you read through this, the majority of states, and so wherever the yellow lettering is, that means they're sort of correspond to each other, and then the red, those correspond to each other. So the majority of states in the US currently have what are known as preferred arrest policies. And so what is preferred? This, in a summary, means this: that it requires, okay, that doesn't sound like preferred, that sounds like require. Okay, let's keep reading. Requires police to either arrest one or both parties at the scene, or they have to write a report justifying why an arrest was not made. So even so, you'll notice it starts off sounding very strong, requiring police to arrest somebody, but there's a loophole. They can write a report justifying why they didn't feel there was enough evidence, or the situation was overblown and there's no need for an arrest. So there's these loopholes that are going to come through with even a preferred or mandatory arrest policy. But I will say this: requiring police to arrest one or both parties at the scene of a domestic violence call has not gone over well either in many situations. And there are examples where mandatory arrest policies, which we'll get to in a second, have actually resulted in increases in domestic violence. So the preferred approaches, where there is some discretion by the officers, allows for them to analyze the specific situation, talk to both parties if available, look for evidence of a crime, and then come to a conclusion. And that sounds good. And for my mind, that makes the preferred arrest policies sound good. But as we will see, it will also require that whoever is responding to these calls has cultural competency and is well versed in a domestic violence situation. And once again, I'll be sharing with you a video that shows some of the training that law enforcement should go through. We'll also talk about how a lot of various law enforcement agencies now have a domestic violence unit where either it's a sworn officer or it is a representative that is brought out to any calls of domestic violence, because they should be the expert in ascertaining what is going on in a situation. And so we'll sort of see that. Other states have, what we see in red there, have adopted mandatory arrest policies. So mandatory, now you're thinking, okay, somebody's got to be arrested, but that's not always the case. All right, what do these do? Well, these require an officer to make an arrest during a domestic violence situation, but, and there's always a but, only if the domestic violence meets certain criteria. And then that will vary from state to state also. So within California and New York, you'll see some of these quote unquote certain criteria. So let's look at California. California has sort of a mix of preferred and mandatory. And so that's what we see here. So officers are typically encouraged to arrest where there's probable cause, right? So if you have enough cause that a crime has been committed, then an arrest should be made. And that would handle with most types of criminal behavior. And they must arrest for violations of domestic violence protective orders. So if somebody's, and so oftentimes we hear these, we'll talk more about these, whether they're temporary orders or whether some people just call them restraining orders in a broader sense. But if somebody violates a domestic violence protective order and officers are called to the location, the person has to be arrested. Also in California, dual arrests are discouraged. And this is at the idea of, the fear of potentially punishing a victim just because the victim fought back. So both the perpetrator and the victim may be bruised, cut up, crying, upset, but California, we try to discourage arresting both individuals and instead trying to identify who was the primary aggressor. And then in line with that, we see that final point, officers shall make the reasonable effort to identify, not identity, but identify the primary aggressor. Now, and even within California, even this is sort of our general status, as we go from county to county and city to city, I can promise you that this is not necessarily the letter of the law everywhere, but it gives you an idea of where we stand. In New York, they tend to have more of the mandatory approach. So officers must arrest the perpetrator either when there's probable cause, very similar to California, except for there's a must there, that they've committed a felony against a member of the household, or when a protective order has been violated. So in many ways similar to California's, except for the probable cause part. They're trying to force the officers to make an arrest when there's probable cause. And in California, it is more of an encouragement, which usually results in an arrest. And then we see our final example for today is looking at North Carolina, which tends to have more of a preferred approach. Officers may arrest the perpetrator when there's probable cause that they've committed a felony, a misdemeanor, and they may cause injury or property damage unless they're arrested, or they've committed one of a specific list of misdemeanors against a household member. So they've got more of a listing down. And you'll notice here, not only are there differences in sort of this idea of what we call preferred arrest policies versus mandatory arrest policies. And one of the things, if I haven't said it enough, I really want you to keep this in mind. Imagine what happens once this gets in front of a mediator or in front of a family court judge or in a criminal court. The letter of how the policies or laws are written or statutes are written can really be picked apart. And you'll notice even with the preferred and mandatory, there's some language that seems to be very strong, like requiring an arrest. Others allow for these loopholes for people to say, no, we don't have to make an arrest, or no, we don't need to blame somebody. When we look down at the three different states, California, New York, and North Carolina, notice that as the language changes, encouraged, must, may, right? Each one of how we phrase these policies and these laws, the wording, the exact language is very, very important. And as we saw, going back to what I talked about earlier, this has been one of the good and bad about progressive pushes for bringing domestic violence out into the open, but also bringing it under the umbrella of law. It helps to provide protections, but sometimes if the laws aren't written well, or if they're written with a nefarious intent by whoever drafted it, you can see that there's loopholes in order to allow perpetrators to still get away with it, and sometimes put extra burden, like the burden of proof on the victim, the burden of shame and embarrassment, the burden of failure, meaning that to have a case dropped because some loophole in the law, and yet you finally got up the confidence to report what your abuser's been doing to you. You can imagine the toll that all these things can take on a victim of domestic violence. So we'll end this one here for today. And then, as I said, look forward to our next series of lectures. We're going to start going into breaking down and understanding domestic violence from a theoretical point of view, to understand the dynamic of what is going on in these situations. So that's it for today. Have a good one.